I am glad to be with us on this here, the fifth Sunday, I think it is, of Lent. I've spent a lot of time in this text for a variety of reasons, and I do a lot of disability justice work and am a person with disabilities. I like this. This reminds me of the scripture where the person's sitting in the window and then they fall out. I know you won't fall out. My sermon is long today, warning, but I know you will not fall out the window, but I like this posture here. But anyway, I personally, academically, professionally, I end up back here for a lot of reasons, because this text is very, very dense. Though it may not appear that way, though Kristen gave it a good cold read, it can be very dense. I've preached it before here. It was the day I shared my autism diagnosis. That day I was internally wrestling with this new thing and people telling me that I did not look autistic and what it would mean to do the work of unmasking, which I am still trying to do and committed to continuing. But as a person with hidden disabilities, unless I communicate them, you may never know them. The same can be said of my gender and sexuality. If I don't share it, or if you have not been read in, so to speak, you may not be aware of some of the things I carry, and it may not impact how we are in community together. That is not the case for someone in the time of John 9 with a disability. Being disabled then, and sometimes now, means you were pushed to the margins of society and out of community. In the Hebrew Bible, I wouldn't, with my bevy of chronic illnesses, be able to preach, because in Leviticus, those born with a blemish were disqualified. In Leviticus 21, beginning at verse 16, it says, "And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to Aaron, saying, None of your offspring throughout their generations," which means forever, "who has a blemish may approach to offer the bread of his God. For no one who has a blemish shall draw near, a man blind or lame, or one who has a mutilated face, or a limb too long, or a man who has an injured foot or an injured hand, or a hunchback or a dwarf, or a man with a defect in his sight, or an itching disease, or scabs, or crushed testicles." I think that's everybody. "No man of the offspring of Aaron the priest who has a blemish shall come near to offer the Lord's food offerings. Since he has a blemish, he shall not come near to offer the bread of his God." Maybe that history of blemish and marginalization is why in our society, the medical model and some mindsets jump directly to the body as a prayer request when it's broken. Maybe that is why people skip to they must need healing when they see someone who is differently abled. I think this text meets us well in this Lenten season. Lent is not a season that rushes to resolution. You don't get to skip to the miracle and call that the entire story. You got to slow down. You got to sit. You have to sit in the discomfort and examine what we've been taught to see and what we've learned to ignore. When we enter John 9, we have to be careful where we place our attention, because this text itself is not only about sight being restored, and surely it is not about the disciples and their foolish question. Now, when I talk about it, and I will not today give it much more than this, I don't even give the question of who sinned attention, because Jesus does not either. It is foolish and it's right to think that, and Jesus tells them as much and skips on to the parts that matter. I appreciate our devotional. I appreciate Tatum and the way she goes beyond the act of healing, which really only makes up the first 8 verses of this pretty long chapter, and invites us to unpack the rest of it, where we find that the true harm is not in this man's disability. The true harm isn't even in the question of sin. The harm is in the way those who know him respond. It is layered. And after this healing, the text continues to go into the community and their inability to adjust. In verse 9, this unnamed man has just experienced an encounter that has changed his whole life. And as he enters the community, the neighbors and those who had seen him before as a beggar begin to ask, "Is this not the man that used to sit and beg?" Some were saying, "It is he." Others said, "No, it's somebody that looked like him." He told them, "No, it's me." The same community that looked upon him when he was sitting and begging don't recognize him now. They do not say, "Hey, is that Bob over there?" Or, "Hey, look, that's Harold's boy down by the river there." No, they name his position in society, the beggar. They knew him categorically. They knew him as a situation, something to pass by, to be interpreted, to explain, but they did not know him. And even when he tells them plainly, "I am the man," they hesitate and turn to debate. They're questioning whether what they are seeing can actually be true, because if it is him, then something about how they've understood him has to change. And sometimes it's easier to deny a person than to disrupt your narratives. This is where the harm begins to surface in the text in a different way, because we often locate harm in the condition. Oh no, they're blind. Oh no, that person is deaf. Or, oh no, they have autism. Or, oh no, that. There's a blame on the body or the person in it. But the text is showing us that the deeper harm is in our responses. The harm is in the inability to receive someone outside of the role and our own definition of what is whole that we've assigned to them. The harm is in our refusal to believe someone about the joys and strengths and possibly challenges of their own lived experience. They asked the man in verse 10, "Then how were your eyes open?" He answered, "I don't know. The man called Jesus made mud, spread it on my eyes, and said to me, 'Go wash.' Then I washed, and now I see." It's a pretty straightforward testimony, and the evidence is there. He has not seen since birth, and now he can, but it is not enough. They bring him to the Pharisees. I invite all of you to be thoughtful here. It will be easy to read this and externalize the issue and turn it into a Jewish problem or a Pharisee's problem, or turn the Pharisees into a single, uniform monolith or group, to make them the problem so we don't have to see how our own selves respond to these types of things. But the text doesn't support that flattening. Even in the group of Pharisees, they are divided and are wrestling with the things going on in their community. What we witness here is not just who they are, but how any of us can respond, something that challenges our frameworks. Because now the question is not simply what happened, but whether what happened fits what they know. The focus is no longer on the man, it is on the method. It is on the rules. It is on whether this act can be sanctioned. The Pharisees, again, creatures of habit apparently, ask him, "How did you receive your sight?" And he tells them the story again. Mud, wash, see. The same answer, the same clarity, the same truth. But as we get down to verse 16, it reveals a fracture. Not a fracture in the man, but in Jesus' act of healing and the way it was understood. Some of the Pharisees said, "This man is not from God," speaking of Jesus, "for he does not observe the Sabbath." But others said, "How can a man who is a sinner," Jesus, "perform such signs?" A sinner because he worked the Sabbath. But they were divided. Notice what is happening here. The man's reality becomes secondary to their bickering and debate. His experience becomes evidence for their argument, not something to be argued on its own terms. Huh? Oh. I love this. No, instead of focusing on the man, so instead of focusing on him and his problem, the focus then becomes the evidence for his argument. Like he can see, he was blind and now he has vision, but now we're arguing, Jesus, is he a sinner? Did he work on the Sabbath? This whole person was blind yesterday and can see today. But they took that, and instead of celebrating and honoring, now we argue Jesus. We see this now in our own time. Black and brown people have named harm only for their lived experience to become a debate about tone, about delivery, about whether or not I said it in the right way. Then the reality of what happened gets pushed aside, and suddenly the conversation is not about whether you slapped me or not. It's about what I said and if I'm believable. We see this towards the LGBTQ community, where someone names who they are, and instead of being received, my identity becomes a theological argument. My life becomes something to be discussed, interpreted, or corrected, rather than something to be honored. You are more worried about the bathroom that I use than the person that I am, and my humanity is decentered. In our text, after a moment, true to form, they ask again, "What do you say about him? It was your eyes he opened." And he said, he's a prophet. He answers within his own understanding. He answers with what he knows, but still, that is not enough, and they turn to his parents, introducing another layer of harm. When they couldn't discredit his testimony, they go looking for someone else to verify. His word is not sufficient, and now he is at risk again of being cast right back out. He barely did made it in. Just imagine, now he's not only trying to manage this new sight that he is received, but he is dealing with their disbelief. Even those closest to him distance themselves to remain safe. The cost of his miracle is too high for them to bear it with him. In verse 24, they call him again. I bet he wished he would have just stayed in the margin. And they said to him, "Give glory to God. We know that this man is a sinner." And if you read it without context, you think they're saying, don't praise Jesus or don't glorify Jesus, but they are not. Give glory to God in that day was not a call to worship. In the New Bible Commentary by Donald Guthrie, it says, it was them calling on him to tell the truth. What they were saying is, liar, liar, pants on fire. They were not asking to understand anymore. They wanted his agreement. And his response is one of the most honest lines in this entire chapter. I do not know whether he is a sinner. One thing I do know, that though I was blind, now I see. He does not step into their argument. He does not try to prove anything beyond his own experience. He simply names what he knows. I was blind then, I see now. Can you imagine what this man is going through? The sensory overload of living all of those years without all of the visual things that happen in this world now have been unlocked. And his eyes have been opened. The overwhelm from not only now seeing, but now being interrogated, and the fatigue of having to repeat yourself while you try to process a whole miracle. How did he feel when he realized that these questions aren't really just questions, because their answer will not change the listener? I remember once hearing in a podcast that many years ago that a person convinced against their will is of the same opinion still. I believe that's what's happening here. No matter how many times he told them, no matter the evidence, they believed what they wanted to believe. This man who was dismissed, who was overlooked, who was categorized as less than, now carries the full weight, as if all of that was not enough, of speaking truth into a space that won't receive it. His lived experience becomes a form of authority they refuse to recognize. And they respond the only way they know how when their framework is threatened. You were born entirely into sin. And are you trying to teach us? And they drove him out. They expel him again. That fact right there is why I speak of this often. And as I shared in the beginning, in an effort not to bury the lead, the harm in this story is not his blindness. The sin is not in him not being able to see. The harm is here in his expulsion. The harm is the disbelief. The harm is the interrogation. The harm is the way community refuses to make space for a reality that does not fit what they already believe. The body that harms in this text is not an individual body. It is the body of believers. It is the community. It is the system that will rather preserve its understanding than expand and extend its compassion. And if we're honest, we can find ourselves in this story, not only in the man, but in the neighbors who couldn't recognize them, and the Pharisees who needed everything to make sense according to their own rules, and in the parents who chose safety over solidarity. It begs the question, what do we truly want for one another? Do we want transformation that fits our expectations? Or are we willing to receive people as they are, even when it disrupts your own norms? Do we want to be right, or do we want to be in right relationships? Because this text is not only about what Jesus does, it's about what we do in response. And I said earlier, and I'll say it again, drawing from something I wrote in an article years ago, this passage does not highlight what was wrong with the person who has a disability. It instead points to the necessity of seeing the individual in their fullness. That is the invitation here, not to fix, not to explain away, not to reduce, but to see. To see beyond the roles we assign to one another, to believe people when they speak about their own bodies, about their own lives, their own experiences, to reject the urge to interrogate simply because you do not understand. By God, read a book. Because when we fail to do that, we don't just misunderstand people, we harm them. We flatten their experience to protect the fallacy in our own frameworks. And if we're going to follow Jesus in this text, and I declare that we shall, then we have to pay attention to what it is he does differently. He sees the man before anything changes. He engages him without asking for an explanation. He does not center blame or sin or require this man to justify his very existence. And even after the community rejects him, Jesus does not. Because the story doesn't end at verse 34. Even though our reading stopped there, there's more. There's always more. And in that space beyond rejection, there is still this encounter that he had with Jesus. There's still belonging that is not contingent on the community to make it right. And that matters. It matters because some of us knows what it feels like to be questioned about our realities. Some of us know what it feels like to have to repeat ourselves to be heard. Some of us have experienced being pushed out of spaces that were supposed to hold us. And yet, even there is still a God who sees. There's still a Christ who meets us. There is still a possibility of community that doesn't require us to become something else, something palatable and manageable. When reading passages like these, when a miracle has been performed, I like to ask a question. Beyond the miraculous, what do we learn about Jesus here? I think for this, part of the answer is this. Jesus is not only concerned about changing conditions, Jesus is concerned with restoring dignity. Jesus is concerned with disrupting systems that harm. Jesus is concerned with making visible what has been ignored. So now the question is, what do we learn about ourselves? What do we see in this mirror that the text is holding up? I think it's asking us whether we are willing to be transformed in how we see, and how we listen, and how we respond. It is asking us whether we are willing to create communities where people don't have to fight for their lives to be believed. It is asking us whether we're willing to let go of frameworks that cause harm, even when it feels familiar, even when it feels theologically sound and right. Because the work of liberation, the work of disability justice, the work of following Jesus is not only what happens in the moment where someone is healed, it's about what happens in the community before and during, and if not. It's about whether we'll be the kind of people that make space. It's about whether you will listen. It's about whether or not you can see. And I don't think that's a small thing. I think that's the heart of the work. And maybe that's the Lenten invitation before us. Not to rush to the resurrection without reckoning, but to become the kind of community that can hold one another in truth, in nuance and complexity, and in dignity. And if we are honest, the question is not whether Jesus is at work among us, but whether or not we'll recognize him when he stands with the ones we've refused to see.